Hello and welcome to the World Soccer Talk podcast, your weekly dose of talking about watching soccer on TV, online and apps. Coming up on episode 42, we discuss whether US sports networks are too soft on the US men's national team, what the Champions League TV schedule reveals about Fox, as well as opinions about the job that beIN Sports and ESPN did in analysing the two recent results by the US team. My name is Christopher Harris, aka The Gaffer, and I'm joined today by Kartik Krishnaiyer. Both Kartik and I we live and work in South Florida, so we're recording this podcast a little bit earlier this week, just because of the impending arrival of Hurricane Irma, which anyone who follows Kartik through social media, you'll know that he's definitely one of the best sources actually for news about the weather, hurricanes, updates, etc. So it's going to be a few eventful few days. Hopefully, Kartik. It hopefully it blows out into the ocean and then disappears, but it's going to be a few rough days. But so we wanted to kind of focus on the soccer at least and kind of talk about some positives before both you and I, Kartik, probably rush back and start putting up shutters and start preparing for the storm that's coming. What do you think?
Yeah, exactly. I actually started preparing yesterday, started clipping my hedges and getting some of that out and trying to tie down some of my potential projectiles. Though this storm is big, it's scary, and it's also unpredictable, and we're still 5 days out or 4.5 days out in South Florida as we record this. So it is entirely possible the storm may not hit us, even though everybody around town is acting as if it's a fatalistic thing. We're all going to die, so get out of town type of thing.
Exactly. So let's talk about some positives and some things that are kind of happier thoughts, which would be anything in regards to soccer. We'll start off. Actually, we'll go backwards this week. So I'm going to start off with the Honduras USA game. We're recording this on the Wednesday. The game was played on the Tuesday night, and we won't get into the US performance yet, but I do want to talk about the coverage from beIN Sports. And to me, overall, I would say it was disappointing. It felt like a B movie. It just felt very low rent, and it felt like there was a disconnection between the studio and the game itself. It wasn't kind of a fluid actually kind of flow in terms of the coverage. Part of the reason for that too is that you have your commentators, Phil Shane and Jovan Karowski, both of which I thought did an extremely great job at commentating the game, analysing. Jovan is a bit bland, to say the least, but what he says is actually some good analysis. He's adding some criticism here and there. No problems there with the commentary. I have a problem though with the commentators being in Miami, as well as the entire studio talent, and then you just have your three pitch-side reporters. So you had Julian Gonzalez, Heath Pierce, and Carmen, I forgot her last name, in San Pedro Sula at the stadium. And what happened, to me at least, well, if you look at the pitch side of things, the pitch side, you had Heath Pierce that was shouting into the microphone. The noise level was obviously pretty high there, but you had Carmen and Julian Gonzalez were pretty calm and speaking kind of at a normal tone, normal volume into the mic, but Heath Pierce kept on shouting. That was really annoying. Then the studio talent themselves, I thought Kevin Egan did a great job as a host. You had Carlos Bocanegra, who I was very impressed by in terms of just remaining calm, very confident, and some great analysis. And some of the good analysis he gave, for example, was talking about Bruce Arena. And in terms of training over the last few weeks with the US team, or last couple of weeks, he most probably went ahead and actually trained two different camps. So one team that was going to play specifically against Honduras, and then another team that would be playing against Costa Rica, and had those teams kind of work together independently. So I thought that was some good analysis. Ali Krieger was poor, just very basic analysis, very basic language. Not much of a vocabulary there, and really no insight or analysis. You had Jimmy Conrad, which I thought was a bit strange. I mean, I'm so used to Jimmy Conrad playing in a nice way, the clown, the comedian. So for him to be providing some straight analysis seemed very strange and wasn't the same way that we're used to experiencing Jimmy Conrad. His analysis was okay, but he just seemed kind of out of place in the whole setup. And then you had who else was there? I think that was it. But yeah, that was it in terms of the talent. The other thing, Kartik, too, was really kind of strange is having them all stand up. So they're in the studio. It was really kind of awkward, uncomfortable for the viewer to watch these guys and Ali just standing up facing the camera. That was just kind of unusual. You don't see that too often. I would have much preferred to have the typical spaceship that we have with the beIN Sports studio and have them sitting in their seats.
Yeah, Ali Krieger had an excessive amount of makeup on also. I mean, maybe it's because I watched the Orlando Pride closely. And by the way, those of you listening who might be Pride fans, the game has been moved because of Hurricane Irma. They're going to be playing tomorrow night, Thursday night at home instead of on Saturday. But so she has to get back to Orlando from Miami from that game, from the studio work. But she had a lot of makeup on, and I don't know if it's the way they angle their cameras or the lighting in their studio. I would be curious, but I've never seen her with that sort of look, honestly.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is too, Kartik, I actually watched the Pride game. I went up to Orlando this past weekend, so I saw her playing up close. And when she was on the set for the Honduras-USA match, I didn't recognize her at first, and I think that was it.
I didn't either. That's why I'm pointing it out. And then I realized, I wasn't able to watch the game as closely as you did. I had some visitors over and Irma prep and all of that, so. It took me in that halftime studio about 2 minutes before I realized who it was. And the only reason I realized it was her was because she's worked for them before and she now plays for Orlando, so it's easy to get to Miami.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so overall I was just very... I guess just disappointed with the performance of the talent. Again, I think Jovan Karowski did great, as well as Phil Shane. It would have been wonderful to have them in San Pedro Sula. It's only, about an hour and a half away by plane from Miami. It's pretty close. It would have been great to have them at least in the stadium.
Yeah, I know someone who actually got a cheap fare as a fan from Fort Lauderdale on Spirit Airlines to San Pedro Sula and went to the game last night. So it wouldn't have been that expensive. Well, I mean, it's not that expensive to send the talent, but then to send all of that other stuff, right? Cameras, whatever things you need for stand-up. Maybe that's where the complication comes in.
Yeah, obviously in this regard, I mean, beIN Sports was playing the USA card in terms of the talent that they selected. And again, Phil Shane and Jovan Karowski did a great job. Kevin Egan you have as a host who's lived in the United States for a number of years, but of course is Irish. But then the rest of the crew was all American. And I think it's one of those things that Carlos Bocanegra, like I said, did a great job. But rather than just putting in just Americans for the sake of putting the Americans in for an American game, I mean, where was, I don't know, like Ray Hudson? Where was, Thomas Rongen probably can't get involved now because he's a scout for the US.
Where's Gary Bailey?
Where's Gary Bailey? Yeah, or why not bring in Janusz Mihalik? Or somebody that's a little bit better in terms of analysis and knows the game. I like
the choice of Jovan Karowski as a co-commentator because I think he's much more. This is probably why Fox doesn't use him on U.S. men's national team stuff, and we'll get to that later in the show. But even though he obviously works for Fox, he has a more of a broader perspective because he played in England, he played in Germany for a long time, played in Portugal. When I've seen conversations with him and he's been asked about the U.S. men's national team, again, I didn't really get to listen to the commentary yesterday. He has had a broader perspective than the vast majority of former U.S. men's national team players. That's not a shot at any one former national team player that's a commentator now, but it's just a general general statement I'm making about when I've observed Karowski in the past. He has different perspectives, I should say.
Yeah, he was strong. Again, it just he's very much almost like a Brad Friedel, where he's just very monotone. You're not going to get a lot of excitement out of him, but if you do listen to him and what he says, he does provide good analysis. I went ahead on Twitter last night it too and asked the listeners to give you to get your feedback also, to see what you guys thought. And we had a few comments coming in through a few tweets. RBO on Twitter says, Phil Shane knows US soccer well from his time calling games for ESPN and did a great job. I like that Jovan Karofsky was partnered with Phil. Joe Gagliardi on Twitter said he agreed. He said, I have a lot of time for beIN's coverage, but not having the commentators at the stadium is weak. Then you had JT Delaney, also on Twitter. He said, I didn't like that Phil and Jovan weren't at the stadium, but they could afford to send 3 sideline reporters. I think a good point there. Gordinho, also on Twitter, he says, you can feel that the commentators are not present live at the stadiums. Jose Martinez on Twitter said, I saw it on NBC Universo, and I liked the commentary there. And then Steve Kelly on Twitter said, more excitement at a funeral parlor. Which that was kind of my overall impression in terms of this game, was that, the game wasn't that exciting. If you're a US fan towards the end, 84th minute, yes. But just the analysis and just the build-up and just how everything altogether with the beIN just felt very.
What was the analysis
blah.
of the US's tactics? Because, look, I tried to work out what Arena's thought process was coming into this game, and I think it was in some ways, unfortunately, a throwback to the Klinsmann era. Well, in many ways it was, but tactically, in where I think in a lot of cases Klinsmann would set up formations to try and utilize the athleticism of the United States and perhaps pace out in wide areas. And what you have against an athletic side like Honduras, who are playing in just this oppressive heat. That's why they scheduled the game for 3:30 local time start time. Is that advantage is negated, and then you don't really have a plan B until you make a shift to a 3-5-2 and bring a Bobby Wood, who's a more versatile man up top than Jordan Morris, into the match, and maybe it changes a little bit of the way you play, and you bring Jeff Cameron in and go to a 3-man back line. But I couldn't figure out what the U.S. was doing, honestly, tactically, and I'm wondering what the commentators said about that.
Yeah, I missed that, unfortunately. So I missed the halftime coverage, and I missed the post-match. But I can tell you that pre-match, there was very little analysis. They had exclusive interviews with Bruce Arena and Michael Bradley just for a couple of minutes each, just kind of saying...
This is why you bring in a guy like a Gary Bailey. I think he probably breaks it. He probably looks at the team sheet, and he can make... I've seen him do this with La Liga games, so the Express. So I think he could probably have added something.
Absolutely. There was a little bit of an analysis from Carlos Bocanegra. Actually, most of the analysis in this game that I saw, again, I didn't see halftime or post-match, but most of the analysis really came from Phil Shane and Jovan Karofsky. Jovan talking about when the US did make those subs late in the game, who he thought was coming out, how the team shape would change and who'd move into which positions. So that was more... The most analysis I heard, and also Phil kind of asking some leading questions, which was great in terms of him just trying to lead Jovan Karofsky along in terms of giving the viewers some valuable feedback. But that was the thing in my notes I wrote, Kartik, pre-match, is that the crew that they had, other than Carlos Bocanegra, I wasn't confident, even if the US had a poor first half, that at halftime that crew would be able to pull apart that and analyze that in a really intelligent way.
I think they really miss Ian Joy since he moved to Fox, because they the last go around when they had this cycle of away games for the U.S. and Mexico, they were able to tap into Ian Joy and Gary Bailey at the end of that cycle. Bodo was with them at the time. Bodo's still with them, I think, but he does more Spanish language stuff. They were able to kind of tap into the expertise of these guys, and now maybe they've copied the Fox model. I don't know. It
seems to be that way, especially with the kind of the very US focus, which to me at the end of the day, I'm just looking for whoever's best available to you. To beIN Sports, rather than just picking people because they're American.
And it's odd in South Florida, right? They're in Miami, so there is such a large Honduran community in South Florida, and there are people in the soccer media here in South Florida. I'm not going to name names, but beIN knows who these people are that are Honduran.
Mm-hmm.
They could have tapped one of those people to come in.
The one name I was surprised that wasn't used was Carlos Ruiz, because they signed him. They announced the signing of him. Like he's quite a man, but it's several months ago as a beIN Sports.
No one knows CONCACAF better than him. He's I think one of the all-time leading goal scorers in this region. So it seems like that would be a good use of talent, of personnel.
Yeah. So hopefully beIN Sports can learn some lessons from this one in terms of what worked and what didn't work. Of course, they're going to have a lot more coverage coming up with a lot more of the World Cup qualifiers between now and early December. The one thing I do want to add, Kartik, on this one before we move on to talk about the USA-Costa Rica game is that Fubo exploded on this one, and not in a good way. It crashed. So actually, the first 5 minutes of the game I was watching on Fubo, and then the quality of the stream got really, really blurry, and then I switched to Sling TV, and the quality was great, and then didn't go back to Fubo. Went, I think halftime maybe I checked Twitter and saw that there was a ton of people complaining that Fubo had crashed. But then actually had to head to my daughter's soccer practice, so I caught the last 10 minutes, and I was able to catch that on Fubo on the app.
I caught the last 10 minutes as well on Fubo. So as I said, we had visitors over, some visitors from London, and family getting ready for Irma. The last 10 minutes, I actually flipped on Fubo and saw Bobby Wood's goal on beIN on Fubo without the commentary. I kept it because I was in the crowd of people, right? So I kept the phone on mute, but. The quality was fine for me on my iOS device after, but it was like the 79th minute. I logged on to Fubo because at my parents' house where I was, we actually had they have beIN, so we were watching on the television, and then we moved to the dining room, so I threw on Fubo. Yeah, and it was fine. It was fine for me.
And there were issues. I think Go90 had issues. I had reports of...
I heard Go90 had serious issues.
Yeah, beIN Sports Connect also, I heard, had some issues too. So a lot of people having issues. Sling worked fine for me, so I was able to watch the game. And then, like I said, the last 10 minutes on the Fubo app as I was traveling. So, Kartik, let's kind of talk now about the USA-Costa Rica game. There's so much. There's so much to talk about on this one. Let me have you lead off in terms of
how many hours do we have? Look, there's just a lot here. This U.S. Costa Rica game. I think you can look at it from two perspectives. One, if the game had been on Fox, there would have been, I think, a different narrative, which would have been about the referees, about maybe the cynical fouling on Pulisic, and although that was a little bit cynical, right? Mm-hmm. Instead of the Kasey Keller comment, which is, well, that happens in CONCACAF. Why don't you have someone else that mixes it up? The U.S. doesn't have Jermaine Jones anymore, so that sort of thing. And there's no Chris Armas, et cetera, on this team, Ricardo Clark, et cetera. I think the narrative was very different. Thankfully, this game was on ESPN and not Fox, because Fox, I think, would have whitewashed the result and would have whitewashed what happened during the course of the match and would have created a different narrative. Ian Darke, thankfully, set the tone where even before Costa Rica gets that first goal, he is leading Taylor Twellman in the commentary, talking about how poorly the U.S. is set up, how poorly they're playing, kind of how naive they are, the way they're distributing the ball out of the back. And I think that set the tone for the broadcast. You also have Kasey Keller, who we don't talk a lot about on the show because we don't see him a lot. But Kasey Keller, I know, is a player, a former player who has who's immensely disliked by some of those people who are very favorable towards U.S. soccer and the Seattle Sounders, because they think he's too critical. They think he's too he says too many negative things about both the Sounders and Major League Soccer, and actually by extension the U.S. men's national team program. He was the perfect guy to have this game in the studio or pitchside studio, and then the next several days on the ESPN FC show. Gave a U.S. perspective that was not national team, USSF, MLS propaganda. Right. Understands the region and was able to give the kind of analysis that I actually wish his competitor, and now he's a competitor at another network, Brad Friedel, goalkeeper Brad Friedel, would be able to give, because Friedel, like Keller, had a long and successful career playing in Europe. But it seems like Friedel doesn't want to give the level of critical analysis that Keller does. So I thought that was a really good get by ESPN. Herculez Gomez, as always, was pretty strong. My one real negative takeaway from this game, and look, it's already been all over Twitter, so Taylor Twellman knows how I feel about his, he and I interacted and went back and forth pretty aggressively on Saturday, and to me, he's the very best American co-commentator we have, so but no one is perfect, right? And I think that I don't know why, but he made such an issue out of the Costa Rican fans at Red Bull Arena, creating a narrative that I think lasted through Saturday and Sunday, which basically said the U.S. Soccer Federation should have had the game in another place where they're not selling this many tickets to Costa Ricans. Now, first of all, let me just point this out. Costa Rica is not Mexico. They're not Honduras. They're not El Salvador. There are not that many Costa Ricans in the U.S. There are probably more Americans in Costa Rica than Costa Ricans in the U.S. It's a politically stable country, it's a peaceful country, and it's a country whose economy is more advanced than the nations around it in that region. So they don't have that many expats in the U.S. There were a lot of Costa Rican fans there, more than would be in Columbus or Salt Lake City or someplace. New York, it's New York, right? Or New Jersey, it's the New York area.
Right.
They were not, from what I have been told by several people who were at the game at Red Bull Arena, they were not dominating the ambiance of the facility until Costa Rica scored that first goal. Mm-hmm. So it was still a 75-25 or 80-20 audience. It was not like Twellman and I talked about the game in our Twitter interaction in Chicago in 2009 when the U.S. played Honduras, and I think the majority of fans were Honduran fans. That was a qualifier. Yeah. And the U.S. had a hard time, and they got through that game. They came from behind to win that. But this was not the same circumstance. But what it did, and I know Taylor Twellman didn't intend this because he is as critical as anyone of the program, it's created a bulwark and a litany of excuses for American soccer journalists and MLS supporters who don't want to drill deeper and give critical analysis with Bruce Arena as the manager and with a team that is predominantly featuring in Major League Soccer. Although the Costa Rica game, there were a few more European-based players. And strangely enough, those were the players who got the most of the blame from this set of writers and fans.
Yeah, Kartik.
Just to finish up on this, I think it's also important to note that that narrative allowed us to not have the conversation about Arena that we were constantly having about Klinsmann after U.S. losses under Klinsmann.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with most of what you've said there too. I mean, I do think that Twellman screwed up on this one. It wasn't intentional. It was one of those things maybe he regrets a little bit in terms of this being the talking point from this game, this being the main narrative. And it was one of those things that I think it's okay to mention during the match, and I think Ian Darke might have mentioned it too in terms of and it was really hard to tell at times too. This is red, white, and blue, Costa Rica, the flag and the colours. Yeah. So, but it was definitely a lot of Costa Rican fans. To his credit,
in the Twitter interaction with me and the ensuing kind of battle, if you want to call it that, it conceded the U.S. were beaten by a better team. That's what happened.
Right.
But so many who took that argument won't concede that. That's my problem. It's not. Right. It's not necessarily with how Twellman articulated. It's with what happened after.
But by focusing on the stadium and focusing on why US played there, that shouldn't have been the talking point. That shouldn't have been the narrative. The narrative, and what Twellman does best is focusing analytically on what the US did wrong. And actually, in this game, to me, really, as a viewer, it was what Costa Rica did right. I mean, there was just a flawless plan in terms of the way they set up, kept their shape. Everything about the way that Costa Rica played was so perfect, and the US seemed to be very unprepared. And almost everything that they did seemed to go wrong in this match. But that should have been the talking point, and I think that's where Twellman's mistake was. Is that he and Ian Darke focused a little bit too much on the venue and the U.S. soccer side of things, which I'm sure they didn't think that would be the takeaway, and it was. And I think they really kind of need to go back to what they do best, which is analyzing the game in front of them. To me at least, you can play anywhere in the US, and for the most part, it's going to be an away game, other than maybe Columbus and maybe some, I don't know, I don't know, Utah or something, but well, not even Utah, but you mean that should not be the focus. The focus should be what's happening on the pitch, not off it. And Kartik, you said that it went on for 5 days. It went on for longer than that. It went all the way through till Tuesday. I think it was like almost like 6 days. It seemed to go on. And I'm sure too, if we look on Twitter right now, there's still people talking about the venue being an issue. So I think ESPN did do a really good job, though. I thought Twellman especially on Costa Rica's first goal, where he honed in on criticizing Jeff Cameron and Tim Ream for just leaving so much space, kind of right down the centre-back pairing there, down that space. I think that was well done. But then the whole venue thing was just... they shouldn't have really even gone there, or just mentioned it in passing, but don't focus on it as an issue. So anything else from this one, Kartik, before we move on to talking about what else we've been watching this past week?
Yeah, I mean, I've watched a lot of European qualifiers, right? Including an outstanding game between Northern Ireland and Czech Republic. It's amazing what Michael O'Neill's done with that team. I watched the Czech Republic, actually. It's not that I followed. I just happened to play Germany and Northern Ireland, two national sides I do follow back-to-back, and that was a whitewash of a game. That was okay. And then I also, obviously, going back a few days, watched the ESPN FC Deadline Day schedule special and the NBC Sports Deadline Day special, and I think those were both well done. The NBC Sports Deadline Day special showed if you get a longer form show where you're analyzing teams as a whole and not just quick events, how good Martino, Earl, and Musto could be, and all three of them were together for this show, which we don't normally have with NBC. It's two of the three, right? I thought it was fantastic. I mean, to the point where I have actually saved the show on my DVR because I want to watch it again in a few weeks. Because I think there was such good analysis, particularly by Martino, but also by Earl and Musto, of all 20 teams, that I feel like it's this kind of benchmark program that you're probably going to want to keep referring back to. So I haven't deleted it from my DVR. It was that good.
I thought it was horrible. Awful.
Well, was it because it wasn't about transfers and it was more about...
It was like gossip. I mean, so at one segment, and actually I took a screenshot, and I think I lost it, but I took a screenshot at one moment because they were just gossiping. They were saying, okay, oh my gosh, did you hear about what happened with Ross Barkley? And he was having a medical, and then he decided to change his mind right in the middle of a medical, and all of them had their mouths wide open, like, oh my gosh, did you hear that? And so much of it was based on rumors. I mean, there's different reports about whether or not that even happened. Most of the reports say that it didn't happen. But when you have something that's so fluid, that's happening, in the moment, and you're hearing reports from the UK, I think where there's very little analysis or very little actually reporting, it's more just discussing about how bad Arsenal was in this transfer window and this, that, and the other. And so much of it was focused on the big teams that, I think for the first 90 minutes, it was focused on basically the top four, maybe not even the top four. It might have been just Arsenal, Man United, and maybe Chelsea. That for fans of the other teams, myself included, I switched it off after an hour and a half. I'm like, I'm not going to be waiting another hour and a half to have, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes of coverage about Swansea. And to me, Swansea was one of the biggest news items in that whole entire transfer window. So, I don't know, to me, that show, it seems to be a waste. For 3 hours to be talking about a transfer deadline day where not that much actually even happened, and for it to be a gossip fest and so focused on the top four, top five, or top six, I thought they
did well talking about Newcastle and Brighton and Huddersfield, etc.
Okay. I didn't get that far. I mean, I switched it off. And part of it, too, was I was burnt out.
They went very much in order. That I'll give you. So if you watched the first hour and a half, you thought they were just talking about teams 1 through 7, right? Teams Man City, Man United through Everton. But they spent a lot of time on West Ham. They spent a lot of time on Stoke later in the show. And they actually... to me, was their preseason preview or their season preview that I thought was so poorly executed the day of the Arsenal-Leicester game. They got a mulligan for that, and to me, they kind of they hit in the hole this time.
Yeah, and again, part of it too was I was burnt out. So I had been watching Sky Sports transfer deadline day on Twitter. I mean, pretty much all day long from I think about 7 or 8 in the morning, and now 12 hours later, then you've got 3 hours of NBC's kind of focus on it. And for those people that missed the main stories of the day, or maybe I don't know. I didn't check the TV ratings to see how well it did or how well it didn't do, but I just thought it was a waste. And I thought, it's something that maybe 3 years ago it would have been a big deal with all the massive signings on the last day, but it just seems to be that the transfer deadline days recently, the last couple of years, have been anticlimactic to say the least.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And then the other thing I would say I watched was the France-Netherlands game, where I thought Adrian Healy and Paul Mariner were very good. We don't hear much of Paul Mariner in the U.S. as a co-commentator. I know he does a lot of the feeds for the Caribbean and Asia, et cetera. He was, I thought, very good, and it was a good call. It was just... it was just a horrible game, and you kind of see, from my perspective, poor Dick Advocaat. Here's this legendary manager. He's come out of retirement to try and rescue his nation's, this is the third time he's managed the Dutch, World Cup hopes, and he's got nothing to work with. It's just a shambles there.
How is Adrian Healy so much better when he's not doing an MLS game?
US games, MLS
games, yeah.
I know.
Yeah, I watched this one too, and I was like, okay, yeah, actually, he's good. He's good with Paul Mariner, and I think
that indicates to us that maybe there is a certain degree of, although it doesn't apply to Taylor Twellman, because Taylor Twellman's good.
Yeah.
MLS games, good. US games, good. Euro games. But for Healy, he seems to take, I don't want to say he takes his foot off the pedal. He's more conscious of what he says and being critical. Maybe just leaves it to Twellman. I don't know, but it's very obvious, isn't it?
Yeah, it seems to be very conversational, more so when he does MLS games, but also very robotic, where he's saying all the right things. And
he's just calling the game, and that's it. He's not actually giving any level of critical analysis or leading his co-commentator into analysis, to the point where there are times Twellman will say, "Hey, Adrian, did you see that? I mean, what do you think?" type of thing. They've been those sorts of interactions between them.
So some of the other games I watched, Kartik, watched Chile against Paraguay. I watched the first 20 minutes of that. And then
wow, that was a stunner.
And then I switched it over and that's the thing that sucks about CONMEBOL is a lot of these games overlap, so they don't have staggered starts. So Chile, Paraguay for 20 minutes. And then I switched to Uruguay against Argentina, which was commentary by Gino Fuentes and George Metellus on beIN Sports. And this one was such a boring, uneventful, 0-0 physical game. I mean, it was really... I mean, the one thing about this game was that it just shows you how lenient the refereeing is in terms of some of these fouls that were committed that would have been straight yellow cards easily, but all the referee would give us a free kick. So Messi got completely rough-ended in this match. Not just this match. I think all of the CONMEBOL qualifying, he seems to get the rough treatment.
Yeah, and I think I watched this match also, and I think a lot of us have an expectation because Sampaoli is coming in, and we know the kind of football he likes to play, the football Chile played, the football Sevilla played. So it was such a disappointment to see Argentina just bogged down. But a lot of that had to do with the hacking, the hack-a-messy, if you want to call it that, coming from Uruguay. But I thought Gino and George, both of whom I know, so I'm calling them by their first names, and both of whom I've worked with, actually, not just know, have worked with, had a very good game, given everything.
Yeah, and then I watched, like you did, to the Czech Republic-Germany game, and I watched, I think, the first 4 minutes until Germany scored, and I was like, I'm done, because this looks like it's going to be a pretty one-way street. It didn't end up being that way, but I switched it over to Denmark against Poland on FS2, and what a good game this was. I mean, it was Denmark completely ripped Poland apart. They won the match 4-0, but just a really entertaining match to watch. And then also a few days later, on the Tuesday, then I watched... this was on the Sunday or Saturday. I watched Wales against Austria. Watched that one on ESPN3, and then because I'm a cord cutter, I was able to watch it through Sling Orange, which you can get ESPN3 through there. I was in a hotel in Orlando, going up there for the Pride game, and saw Wales win that one. So it was a great performance and a great goal by Ben Woodburn for Liverpool. Watched England-Slovakia, and then Moldova against Wales, another win for Wales. And I think that's about it, Kartik, for this past week.
Yeah, I watched Ukraine-Iceland. In between all this hurricane stuff on Tuesday, and that match, the result of that match and the match of Turkey-Croatia, we knew that was going to be the group of death in European qualifying, but I think all four could still go up go up. Excuse me, I'm thinking of championship going to the Premier League. Could qualify for the World Cup automatically. All four could end up in the playoffs, or all four could miss the World Cup. So that being the group of death has certainly happened, played out. Croatia, Iceland, Ukraine, Turkey. At best, only two of those nations will be in the World Cup. And the way they played, maybe all four deserve to be in it, which is why we're getting an expanded World Cup. But I don't think we need any more CONCACAF countries in the World Cup. So, that's a discussion for another day. I would like to see more European and South American countries in a World Cup, but not more CONCACAF countries. Yeah,
we might get to that actually in the featured topic segment. I got a little bit on that a little bit later. Okay, let's move on to TV streaming news, Kartik, and let me have you kick it off.
Yeah, some news we knew that was coming. We've thought it's been coming for years, and it's finally happened. John Motson, Madi, has announced this will be his final season as a commentator for BBC Sport. He will not be retiring, however, so he won't be with BBC Sport any longer, but we could see Madi pop up in various places. He's had 50 years now with the BBC. He's done 200 England games. That includes England games in major competitions, World Cups and Euros. He's called 29 FA Cup finals, 10 World Cups, and 10 Euros. And I believe of those World Cups, he's called the final most of the time. I've read Madi's autobiography, and he actually was there's internal competition at the BBC. He lost the 94 final and was able to regain it for 98 and called the final in France. Brazil-France final. He talks at length about even the pregame for that match. If you're interested in just how commentators get information, Ronaldo, not Cristiano Ronaldo, the Brazilian Ronaldo, there was no idea whether he was going to play, and there were rumors circulating around the stadium and around the town for hours before the game. And Madi kind of captures that and encapsulates how commentators prepare for matches, particularly when there's so much uncertainty around the star player. So I recommend that autobiography for anyone who's interested.
Yeah, those numbers are just, hugely impressive in terms of the number of games he's covered. But 10 World Cups. I mean, that just goes to show you how long he's been around, but also at the top of his game. And this season he'll continue to do the BBC Match of the Day, some commentaries here and there. After he retires from the BBC, it'll be interesting to see where he ends up, if he'll do an occasional match, perhaps for, who knows, ITV or some other channel, or maybe go abroad.
Production.
Yeah, it's quite possible. Not a lot of news this week, but one more news item, and that is that we've uncovered what the TV schedule is going to be for the first game week of the UEFA Champions League on US TV. So that's coming up next Tuesday and Wednesday, as well as Europa League on next Thursday. And not surprisingly, Fox Sports has again gone for a very heavy Premier League focus in terms of the choices of the games that they're going to select to be on FS1. So, for example, on Tuesday's match day, the biggest match to me is Barcelona against Juventus. That is on FS2. Instead, Fox went ahead and put Manchester United against Basel on FS1. And then the same thing, well, actually, to a lesser extent, on the Wednesday, depending on which way you look at it, there's actually a lot of really good matches on the Wednesday. But FS1 is going to show Dortmund against Spurs instead of Real Madrid against Apoel. And the Real Madrid game is on FS2. The Liverpool game against Sevilla is going to be on Fox Sports Net. And in addition to those games too, there's going to be some of the games going to be on ESPN Deportes, ESPN3, Fox Deportes, so on and so forth. So we have the complete schedule at worldsoccertalk.com on the homepage. But Kartik, are you surprised at all by Fox's continuation?
No, I think they're in a position where whenever they can show English teams, they tend to show it, even though they don't have the rights to the Premier League anymore. They know what drives coverage.
Yeah, but Barcelona, Real Madrid, you would think that those teams would generate higher numbers than the Premier League.
But the Barca-Juve game, if it had been up against Dortmund-Spurs, I think they might have done. Oh, well, the Dortmund-Spurs game may also be because of Pulisic. So,
yeah, that's true. Yeah, so I mean, it's been this way for years with Fox, even going back to the Fox Soccer Channel. I mean, they've always put the Premier League teams in first place in terms of the selection, first choice. Also
Premier League teams tend to struggle more in Europe and create more competitive matches, whereas Madrid and Barcelona don't. Let's be honest about it.
That's true.
At Dortmund, you want to also show not just because of Pulisic, but because they're open, entertaining, and exciting. They score a lot of goals. They create a lot of chances. They also concede a lot of goals. Concede a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, and a Europa League too. So Fox went with a heavy Premier League focus too. So on the Thursday, it's the Everton's match against, I think, Atalanta is on FS2. And then nothing on FS1. But then the 3:05 game, Eastern Time, is Arsenal against Cologne. So, and then again, ESPN and other broadcasters are picking up some of those other games. And we've got that schedule too at worldsoccertalk.com. Let's move on to TV ratings. Not a lot to talk about here, Kartik, because of the holiday, Labor Day on Monday, and these numbers are still coming in. So we'll have these on worldsoccertalk.com, probably the full numbers on Friday. But just to throw out some numbers there, the USA against Costa Rica game on ESPN, that had just over 1 million, 1.069 million people watching that game on a Friday, which is pretty decent.
On a Friday night at the start of a holiday weekend. Yeah, it's pretty good.
And then you had Netherlands against Bulgaria, ESPN2, that had 373,000, which I'm surprised by that, Kartik. You would think that there's not a lot of Dutch or Bulgarians in the United States, but it's a World Cup qualifier, and the Dutch aren't doing that great anyway.
Yeah,
but
I don't know if there was a college football lead-in or...
I'm not sure. Yeah, and then we had Spain against Italy. We don't have the English numbers on this one, but Fox Deportes showed that one and had 316,000 viewers.
You can add one to that for me, because I obviously watched that game, as I mentioned, and was incredibly disappointed. I mean, in fact, I don't like international breaks. I don't really like international football compared to club football. This was the one game I had circled on my calendar. Okay, you cannot miss this game. And it was a dud. I mean, it was great to watch Spain, but... boy, the gap in class was not what I expected.
Yeah, and then last but not least, Portugal against Hungary. Actually, it's Hungary against Portugal. That one was 153,000 people watched that one on Fox Deportes on Sunday. And again, we don't have the English numbers quite yet. So moving on, Kartik, to the listener mailbag, and we have one message that came in. This one through Facebook from Raymond Orozco, and he says, I'd just like to give a lot of credit to Costa Rica. I think some soccer journalists are underselling what a huge performance Costa Rica gave. There was too much nonsense about the stadium situation. US fans just like to complain. Other countries have similar scenarios as well. When England plays against Scotland, and there are tons of Scottish fans at Wembley, and when Germany played Turkey 2 years ago, they had a similar mix of crowd. And I think Shaka Hislop is 100% correct regarding this team being the worst in 20 years. In 2002, the US had Friedel, Donovan, Rayner, McBride, O'Brien, Sana, and DeMarcus, just to name a few. What do you think, Kartik?
Preach on, Raymond. I agree with every word you put in there. I've made those same points about those same players in 2002. I even throw in some of the other guys on that 2002 team beyond Johnny O and Claudio Reyna and Brian McBride. I think those are the three really obvious ones, right? That the U.S. has not replaced. The U.S. doesn't have any players at the level of those three guys. And Donovan and Beasley were obviously DeMarcus Beasley still starting for the U.S. Started for the U.S. last night at 35 or however old he is now. I think when you talk about the crowd, it is just a canard. It is an absolute dodge. And here's the other thing. I think other than Mexico, who U.S. Soccer writers tend to study somewhat obsessively, maybe it's also because we have so many Mexican Americans in this country that follow Liga MX, etc. They don't really know much about other CONCACAF nations. So this has been a bugaboo of mine for years, that when the U.S. would play Honduras in 2009 or 2013, and Honduras was in their kind of golden generation of players, there didn't seem to be any analysis of the fact that Honduras had David Suazo missing, or Rambo was injured, or whatever the case would be. And I think that's the case with Costa Rica. You look player for player, Costa Rica versus the United States, there is no comparison.
Yeah,
right? Costa Rica is miles better. The reality of this situation is, other than that 2002 team where you had outstanding players like Reyna, McBride, Johnny O, Landon Donovan, you had Johnny O, by the way, is John O'Brien, for those who don't know my colloquialisms. The U.S. has tended to punch above their weight in terms of the kind of player quality they have historically. They're not doing that anymore. They're now back to where they should be based on their player quality, and I don't think that there's the level of analysis or understanding of this that there needs to be among American soccer journalists. We'll get more into this in our featured topic of the week, but I think that there's a lot of there's just a lot of disappointments I'm having with the people who cover soccer in this country that have become apparent to me in the last 6 to 12 months.
So that leads perfectly actually into our featured topic of the week. So let's talk about it. And Kartik, I mean, the analysis out there, so from Fox as one example, or beIN Sports too, I don't think you're going to get that amount of critical analysis where somebody's going to stand up and say, I think that this is the worst U.S. national team in 20 years. What, like Shaka Hislop said on ESPN. And I believe too, I agree with you too, Kartik, and I agree with Shaka Hislop, that the current US squad is far from the greatest at all. And we had
not even close.
Well, there was an interesting conversation, and we posted this on Twitter. You sent it to me, Kartik, too, and it was ESPN FC, where they had Craig Burley, Hercules Gomez, Kasey Keller, and Dan Thomas, and Steve Nicol. Yeah. And they were debating the US-Costa Rica game and having an analysis about, Burley kind of focused, really zeroed in on whether this US team is a good team or a mediocre team. And based on kind of people's opinion to that, then he went in on okay, well, the way that CONCACAF is set up, and with the US, they could end up in fourth, but still actually qualify for this World Cup. And all they have to do is just do better than Panama and do better than Honduras. Oh, I'm sorry, Trinidad. Was it ranked number 73 and number 85 or something like that? And Hercules Gomez got really, really upset about this. So it was a great debate. I mean, kind of back and forth between the two. Hercules was a little bit more defensive, kind of trying to protect the US, in my opinion. And Burley was going all out in terms of just as a critical analysis, saying in terms of this team not being good at all. But it does lead into our topic of the week, which is focusing.
But also got into, I think, a fundamental thing here, which we need to discuss. And people misinterpreted in a lot of cases, my criticisms of Jurgen Klinsmann, because I think he was a terrible manager, bad tactically. But Burley started off his rant by saying, for the U.S. soccer media, it's been blame the German American players or blame Jurgen Klinsmann. That's been the mantra. Right. That's been the fallback position for the last 6 years. Now that they don't have that, they have to get a new boogeyman.
Which is the venue. Which is kind of, Twellman kind of fed into that by his mistake, really fed into that in terms of that being now like the latest thing that everyone's talking about. That's the excuse, and that was the title of that episode, or that kind of segment on ESPN FC was, that there's too many excuses. That there's, what's the next excuse in terms of US's performance? But the featured topic of the week is really kind of focused on in terms of discussing whether the US soccer audience is receptive to that type of critical analysis, whether it's on ESPN or Fox or beIN Sports or anywhere else, and the impact it has on TV ratings. Historically speaking, Kartik, the US soccer media, and as a result too, I think the US soccer audience, most of coverage has been very positive. There's very little, very critical or negative kind of focus. It's more kind of being very positive, kind of just focusing game by game. The US will get through this, don't worry, everything will be okay, and then we kind of forget about it, and then Fox goes into their rah-rah USA. USA qualifies for the World Cup in a playoff match, beating Australia or Syria or whoever it is. But the question is whether or not you think the U.S. soccer audience...
Yeah, they dodged a major bullet by South Korea not falling to that playoff, because I was thinking if the U.S. somehow ended up against South Korea, there could only be one winner. That would be South Korea, unless there were a red card or something funny happens.
But do you think? Do you think the U.S. soccer audience is kind of would be receptive to more critical analysis?
No, they're not. And in fact, I've Now, people can say I'm being a coward and whatever, and I've seen some people say that, and I tend to wear my heart on my sleeves on Twitter, so this tells you how extreme the U.S. men's national team fan base is. I have a policy now for about 6 months that I won't tweet during U.S. games. And those of you who follow me have seen it the last 2 games this week, because U.S. fans are so irrational and are so unwilling to accept the kind of very basic critiques, I think, fans of most club teams around the world and most national teams around the world are willing to accept. And again, I think that there are some very sophisticated U.S. men's national team fans, but the ones on Twitter during games and the ones who really kind of are spoon-fed information by Fox and by certain members of the media, certain writers who cover the U.S. men's national team and cover Major League Soccer, it is a very positive, cheery narrative. Either we're always making progress, we're always getting better, we're always closing the gap with Mexico, we're always closing the gap with the top European countries, and when things don't go our way, it's because the referees weren't good, the conditions weren't good. Oh, we never should have hired this German coach. These German Americans, they're not committed to the United States. They're not really Americans. So if we just had American players instead, we'd be better off. We don't need guys who speak German in the team. There are these consistent fallback positions, and there is a large percentage of the fan base, and they're very vocal, that buy into that stuff. Mm-hmm. Now, again, I don't know if the commentators on Fox, the soccer writers, we'll get a little bit more into the soccer writers in a minute. I don't know if they necessarily believe what they're saying or they know what the audience wants to hear and they're feeding that narrative. It's almost worse if it's the latter.
Yeah, I think it depends. It's a case-by-case situation. I think, you could take, I don't want to go through names, but you could take certain people and it's definitely an act. Others, I think they're being honest and providing their honest feedback. But in many ways, it's a difficult road to navigate because, look at Fox Sports. They have the rights to the World Cup, all the way through to 2026. So in many ways, they have to be pro-USA. Well, they don't have to be. They are very pro-rah-rah USA. And they've backed off on being critical or negative about the U.S. men's national team. And I think in many ways, because it's self-serving, so their perspective is that, number one, they want to protect their access to the U.S. coach and players because, if they're being too critical or too negative, there's a chance that perhaps they might not get those one-on-one interviews with Bruce Arena or whoever it may be. So that's one thing. But I think the second thing, though, too, is that by having a very rah-rah USA Go Team America, it definitely helps with the TV ratings. And if their focus, their analysis is more critical, more negative, more realistic, should I say, I think it's going to actually turn some viewers off, more your mainstream fans that just watch I hear that from American fans who I've told, hey, watch ESPN FC. Oh, Shaka Hislop hates the U.S. because he played for Trinidad, and Burley just hates Americans. No, that's not the case. Mm-hmm. Okay, not at all. In fact, I think Shaka knows more about this region than any of the guys on Fox. But that's a whole other issue. But that's the reaction. That's the reaction I get from some of these people. And that's the thing, though, too. When Fox does cover games with the U.S. men's national team, the person that's probably I respect the most in terms of providing some honest feedback or some realistic feedback or analysis is Fernando Fiore. Because oftentimes you have Rob Stone, who's in the tank for the U.S. You have Alexi Lalas, who's in the tank for the U.S. Winalda, who may not even be there because they don't want him to be involved in those types of discussions. Or you have Brad Friedel or Stuart Holden. And they're all in the tank for the US. And Fernando Fiore is kind of oftentimes the one guy who stands up and says, no, the US played poorly. Yes, I want the US to win, but they need to improve. And that's the thing, too, in terms of the World Cup coverage, is that I think in many ways is that Fox believes that they have to be positive because they have to play the game, keep their access, keep all this lovely discussions and conversations and networking within the U.S. soccer system, keep everyone friendly, don't create any enemies. But at the end of the day, the biggest reason is to create a very rah-rah USA because that's going to sell TV ratings, that's going to sell advertising, that's going to get people tuning in to watch these matches rather than being a very kind of analytical or critical, where it's a downer. It's depressing sometimes watching this U.S. national team, and we've been there through Klinsmann's years of some of these games being like really, really almost too awful to watch in terms of the performance, getting ripped apart. So
that is part of it. I will tell you another part of it is that there is a general insecurity among U.S. people who work in U.S. soccer, people in the federation, people in the U.S. soccer media about the popularity of European football in this country. There is a general kind of fear of how many people are watching Real Madrid and Barcelona and watching the Premier League and watching games that have no American players and no real kind of domestic import. And there is there's a contempt of that, but there's also a fear. And I think there's also a doubling down on a narrative that we're making progress against that. MLS is better than you think it is. Although, these CONCACAF qualifiers, I don't think necessarily show weakness in MLS. There've been a lot of players in MLS who've done quite well. Just a lot of them aren't playing for the U.S., right?
Yeah.
How also I think American soccer writers, Chris, watch the game, and I'm sorry about this. What I'm going to say, what I'm about to say, it's part of a conversation I've had with several journalists through the recent years here. I think a lot of American soccer writers are good reporters. They're really good at breaking stories. They're really good at writing match reports and telling you what happened. Who scored the goals, who got the red cards, etc. Producing that, getting team news before games, kind of being a beat writer, right? Mm-hmm. Like a trained newspaper beat writer. Yep. I don't think many of them are really, and there are very notable exceptions. I'm not going to get into names on the discussion, but I think a lot of them don't really understand the sport and what they're watching and the complexities of tactics and some of the changes that have to be made on the fly in games and really how abject the product is at times the U.S. is putting out there and how it would compare to similar products around the world, and don't know how to analyze the way Costa Rica has played. Now they're playing this way still, but this has started under Pinto in the 2014 cycle, and how they use their personnel and how that comes up against the tactic that Arena set out to play on Friday night in that game. There just isn't enough drilling deep and understanding what a guy like Kellen Acosta, who's a central midfielder who's supposed to be protecting and complementing Michael Bradley's skill set. There isn't enough of an analysis of what that guy is not doing, because they don't want to pick on him. He's a young MLS guy. He's one of the poster childs for Major League Soccer now. So then the blame falls on Michael Bradley, right? Michael Bradley just isn't very good. Michael Bradley has regressed. Well, yeah, I think he has regressed since coming to MLS, but I don't think he's regressed nearly as much as the narrative kind of tells us at this point. There are just basic tactical things that, and I get on English journalists all the time, but these things wouldn't fall through the cracks in the English media, Chris. Yeah, they certainly don't fall through the cracks in the German, Spanish, and Italian, especially the Italian media. It's getting to a point where I think there are just a lot of people who they may not consciously be company men, but in reality they are.
Yeah, I was just thinking too, Kartik, in terms of some of the, it's two different skill sets. So if you have a journalist who understands, who's got a journalism degree, understands how to write and interview and all that stuff, and then you have somebody that has a lot of intelligent knowledge of soccer, has seen the game and understands kind of different levels of the game from the coach's perspective, the player's perspective, et cetera, et cetera. There are two different skill sets, and it's very hard to find people that have those in one. I mean, I look to Michael Cox and Jonathan Wilson as two people that are very nerdy in many ways, but have it to, the nth degree in terms of being really specialized in that area. I can't think of anyone in the US that has that type of analysis that can really read a game and talk intelligently at a high level. Maybe Gab Marcotti, but Gab's more, he's based in the UK, but a different type of reporter then again. Sports Illustrated had one, and I can't remember his name, and he was, I believe, from Romanian descent, and essentially got run out by US soccer because he was being critical of the national team in terms of, I think, tactics and the way they were setting up. and eventually,
and just that it's also just not the tactics of the coach. I have to point this out. It is the tactical naivety and positional sense of most of the American players you see on this national team. I would say that the only two exceptions on this team right now are Michael Bradley and Josie Altidore. I think the rest of the guys are and Jeff Cameron maybe. I think the rest of the guys have no positional sense. They're not tactically aware enough or sharp enough to play at this level. It's not just technical. It's not just about coaching. It's not just about motivation. There are some guys who fundamentally are not skilled enough in their sense of positioning on the soccer pitch during a match of the caliber of the Costa Rica game. Honduras, much slower match, but the Costa Rica game to actually function. Now, actually, Altidore and Bradley are both in MLS, so it's not a shot at MLS. It's a shot at the U.S. development system and the way we teach the game in this country.
Yeah, I mean, Pulisic you have to include in there too in terms of his positional sense.
He doesn't know yet. But he'll get there.
But he seems it comes naturally almost to him. But yeah, I mean, going back to what we said though too. I mean, so you look at say Michael Cox and Jonathan Wilson. There was one guy with SI.com, and I forgot his name, but he got run out of the business essentially because I think he quit Twitter. He quit journalism, I believe, just because he was getting such a tough time from a lot of the critics that were being very critical of him for speaking out about these topics. But for the most part, you look at the Grant Walls of the world. I mean, there are more. I mean, he just signed a contract with, renewed his contract with Fox Sports. They're more kind of your feature type of article type of guy. He's not going to be, he will be critical at times on Twitter, but he's, it's self-serving for him to basically go ahead and promote the U.S. national team because that promotes Fox Sports coverage of that. So, it benefits him too in terms of people tuning in to watch Fox Sports and have him talk about MLS during a UEFA Champions League halftime or pre-match. But, I mean, that's the thing though too. I think U.S. soccer media as a whole are specialists in asking softball questions and not asking those tough, difficult, hard questions. And it just seems to be a very special relationship between the press and the U.S. Soccer Federation set up in the United States, where it's you have to play the game. You have to play by the rules. Don't be overly critical. Don't ask those tough questions. Otherwise, you might have your access pulled or credentials pulled. And I think it's one of those things that it really fosters a relationship where that's one of the reasons that we get a very rosy picture from whether it's Fox or sometimes ESPN or beIN Sports or the U.S. soccer media themselves is because they're just trying to maintain that relationship with the U.S. national team.
Or they don't understand what they're watching in a lot of cases. Look. Yeah. Kellen Acosta, I mean, I've been hearing people rave about him for a long time. Matt Hedges is another one. I've heard people rave about. People who know, I think, a fair amount about soccer and know an awful lot about MLS. These guys aren't ready for the international level. I watched Acosta on the Honduras game. There is criticism of Michael Bradley, and a lot of it is warranted. But so much of the criticism of Michael Bradley comes because the guys he's partnered with on the U.S. team are generally MLS players or guys who haven't been that successful, who just don't get positioning. And part of that comes from the coach and all of that. I think Darlington Nagbe is a mismatch with Michael Bradley, but you don't get this level of analysis, is my point. I mean, I could go through all the different player scenarios, but I'm not going to. I think there are very few American players that are tactically savvy enough to be at the level of the guys Raymond mentioned earlier, the Reynas, the Johnny O'Briens, the Landon Donovans, but we don't get that level of analysis. What we get is the young players are constantly getting better in this country. Look at what the MLS academies are doing. Look at what the players USL and NASL are producing. Well, look at we have a much deeper and stronger player pool than we've ever had before. That's bunk, okay? Maybe we have 100 guys who are playing at a certain level and we used to only have 50, but the top 20 of that 50 10 years ago was better than they are now. There's no question about that if you're objective about it. But the TV networks and the print journalists who cover U.S. soccer are really not. They don't have the autonomy, I feel, and it's not a written rule, but it's an unwritten rule. They don't have the autonomy to actually make this case.
Yeah, and sometimes too. I mean, for the TV side of things, they don't even have the time. I mean, Ronaldo might get 20 seconds to analyze the weaknesses of a U.S. team against whoever they play against. And in 20 seconds, I mean, by the time you start that topic, your time's up, and he moves on right to the next person, to Friedel or Lallis or something that talks right over you. But that's the thing, though, too. I think it's a vicious circle, because by Fox, which will be Fox for the next World Cup if the US makes it, which I'll get to in a minute. But it's a vicious circle, because they're going to be positive. Lallis last week, I think on, was it 442, said that the US national team is capable of winning a World Cup. It's a very rosy, very positive standpoint, and it feeds in.
Have they watched one Germany game? They realize the standard?
Yeah, Germany's like light years ahead of anyone, not just US.
Well, yeah, all right, but the German C team would beat the United States without much of a problem.
Right.
Have they watched? Okay, Germany is an extreme example. Have they watched any of these European qualifiers? Have they watched? And I know I beat up on them through the years, but have they watched Roberto Martinez's Belgium team, and they somehow think the U.S. would beat that team? Mano y mano. Have they watched even? Have they even watched Northern Ireland? I mean, that's. Have they watched Croatia? No. I think again, these assumptions are being made because they're not watching anyone other than Mexico. They watch Mexico and they watch the United States, and they make assumptions based on that and what they feel like they have to say. I don't think, and maybe they watch England and see how bad England is. That might be the other example of this.
And that's a poor measuring stick to look at in terms of how you kind of think of the rest of Europe at that level, which is not. So yeah.
They haven't even been watching Costa Rica. Costa Rica has been the best national team in CONCACAF for the last 5 years. Yet coming into this qualifier, we didn't even talk about the lead up to Friday. I'm going to mention it really briefly here. There was such an disrespect or contempt, I would even say, for Costa Rica and their accomplishments in the print media, not necessarily on Fox or ESPN, which was basically, Costa Rica, they're ahead of the U.S., but the U.S. got off to a tough start because of Klinsmann, right? It's all Klinsmann's fault. Mm-hmm. And basically, this is at home. The U.S. always wins its home qualifiers. Costa Rica hasn't won here since 1985. It'll be a walk. That was the implication. Mm-hmm. There was no real analysis of how Costa Rica plays, why they were a quarterfinalist in the last World Cup and really outplayed the Dutch. They should have been in the semifinals. Right. There was no taught why they had a strong qualifying campaign, even though they had a bit of a wobble here in the middle until this U.S. game. There's no analysis of that, really. I mean, there were a few pieces here and there, but for the most part, no, it wasn't there.
Plus, I think everyone forgets that, their goalkeeper plays for Real Madrid. So,
right. That's the most obvious thing.
Right.
They have a guy on their team starting for Real Madrid who has won 2 UEFA Champions League titles. And he's playing against the United States, who has Pulisic at Dortmund, and that's about it as far as big clubs.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I really think that the U.S. soccer media, I mean, we are tough on the U.S. men's national team because we want to see it improve and succeed. But I think really the TV networks and the soccer media.
I heard a comparison about how Navas and Timmy Howard in his prime were comparable goalkeepers. And I again, love Tim Howard. I think he did a lot to advance the cause of American soccer players in England after Kasey Keller, John Harkes, Brad Friedel, and others had opened the door. But I watched a lot of Everton. I watch a lot of Everton, which I think everybody realizes. And no, he's not he has never been a Keylor Navas level goalkeeper.
Yeah, the fact of the matter, though, Kartik, is that, I mean, it's crazy in terms of the CONCACAF group. So the US could finish in 4th in a group of 6 and still qualify for the World Cup through a playoff.
This is Burley's point, by the way.
Yeah, it's a huge point. So I mean, look at Wales, for example. So Wales is in a group of 6. The other teams in the group are Austria, Ireland, Serbia, Georgia, and Moldova. Now, Wales right this second is in second place. If they finish in second, they have to go through a playoff game, which would be against a team. It could be Italy, it could be Portugal, or it could be another heavyweight. But out of the 9 groups in Europe that are trying to qualify for the World Cup, only 8 of those groups, the second place team in 8 of those groups will actually qualify to go into the playoffs. And right this second, out of those 9 groups, those second place teams in those 9 groups, Wales would be left out. So even if Wales finishes second in their group against, with teams like Austria, Ireland, Georgia, Serbia, and Moldova, they wouldn't even make it to the playoffs and wouldn't even be able to make it through to the World Cup that way. And even if they do...
They have a guy who starts for Real Madrid and a guy who starts for Arsenal, by the way, on their team.
Right. And so even if they do make it into one of those final 8 playoff spots, they still may have to go up against Italy or Portugal or somebody else.
How about Northern Ireland? Talk about the British Isles. They have won 5 successive games in qualifying. They have 19 points. The U.S. has not won. I may be wrong about this, but I don't think the U.S. has won successive qualifying games this entire cycle. Yet they have a better chance of making the World Cup than Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland will finish second in their group. They will probably make that playoff. They're in a group with Germany. They've won 5 successive games, and they have a more difficult road from this moment onward to the World Cup than the United States does, who have not won consecutive games in this entire qualifying, in this entire phase of qualifying.
And that's the thing, though, too. I mean, the US has this huge safety net. Where there's other better footballing teams around the world that don't have that. So the US has a huge safety net, which gives them a huge opportunity to still qualify for the World Cup. And really where we're at in terms of, the US was 6 minutes away from losing against Honduras, which would be, even with a defeat, they still might have gone through. But still, getting that draw is vital.
Yeah, Honduras is really bad. The U.S. was going to finish 3rd or 4th regardless, even if they lost that game. Honduras is terrible. Yeah. They wouldn't finish in there. I think the top 4 are set. It's just a matter of whether Panama's 3rd or the U.S. is 3rd and gets the automatic spot. Mexico and Costa Rica 1 and 2. It is very easy. The CONCACAF qualifying process is very forgiving, and I think it's a situation where, from a commercial standpoint, you have a confederation that has consistently put money and making money over sporting competition. We talked about this during the summer with the Gold Cup. The fact that we have Gold Cups every 2 years. The fact that we always have the Gold Cup in the United States and it never moves. The fact that they figured out a way to get a game against the U.S. versus Mexico to generate even more revenue, to determine who goes to the Confederations Cup. The Confederations Cup, not the World Cup, the Confederations Cup. They had a playoff for that. No other confederation would do that. This is a confederation that has consistently put financial profit above sporting merit and sporting competition. Therefore, you have this hexagonal, which basically guarantees the U.S. and Mexico make the World Cup. We're talking about the U.S. right now. What about Mexico 4 years ago? There's no reason they should have made the World Cup, given how they perform. And they wouldn't have in any other confederation. And basically, it guarantees 2 U.S.-Mexico games and the revenues from those games. Compare this to Africa, where it's really a crapshoot. You could end up in the wrong group and have no chance of making the World Cup. Poor Bob Bradley learned this with Egypt. He had the forgivingness of CONCACAF, although I think his cycle went much better than Klinsmann's or Arena's. Remember, Arena had a hard time qualifying. The time the U.S. got to the quarterfinals, the U.S. almost didn't qualify for the World Cup. Let's not forget that. If they had been going through another region, they wouldn't have made it. In Africa, you could have a situation like Bradley at Egypt, where he excels in qualifying, but then because of the way they've set it up that time, they get a blind playoff draw. Lo and behold, they get drawn against Ghana at the height of Ghana's powers. Best team in Africa at the time. Maybe Cote d'Ivoire was close. And you look at the African groups, even for this World Cup qualifying cycle, you see strong nations that could make an impression in a World Cup in Russia next summer that were grouped in with other strong nations and therefore won't be making the trip. And I've heard people actually defend CONCACAF, saying, well, half of the South American Confederation, half of their teams go to the World Cup and they group them all together. Isn't that just as easy? Please. Again, you just know the difference in quality between Honduras and Honduras, who's not going to make a World Cup, and Peru, who's not going to make a World Cup, right? Or Ecuador, who's probably not going to make the World Cup. It's not even worth having the conversation.
Yeah, I think the bottom line is that the US has it easy in many ways, not only in terms of qualifying out of the CONCACAF group into the World Cup, but in terms of the way that they're treated by the media, whether it's television and or the written press too. So. But anyway, it's frustrating, but it is one of those things that at least we can see through it and see the light. Kartik, where can listeners find you on the internet, especially over the next few days with all these weather updates and soccer news?
KKFLA737 on Twitter.
All right. And then thanks for listening, guys. You can get a new episode of the World Soccer Talk podcast every Thursday. Every episode is released on SoundCloud, YouTube, Stitcher, iTunes, Audio Boom, and worldsoccertalk.com. If you like the show, share it with your friends on social media and give us a review. And Kartik, what should they do?
Enjoy your football.